It's time for Ralph and Vicki's Off-Grid podcast with your host, outdoor writer Pete Rogers. We're coming to you from the Hunter's Blend Coffee Studio. Hunter's Blend Coffee, defending hunting one cup at a time. Now, let's get into this week's show.
Welcome back to Ralph and Vicki's Off-Grid podcast. I'm your host, Pete Rogers, and today we have with us a special guest. He's a native of New England and has worked as a certified wildlife biologist in the Southeast for over 30 years. He has a BS from the University of Vermont and a Master's of Science from the University of Georgia in Wildlife Management, extensive experience in whitetail research and management, and written and published extensively on deer habitat and population management in the Southeast. He's a past recipient of the QDMA's Deer Manager of the Year Award and currently the chairman of the Deer Committee of the Southeast section of the Wildlife Society, which he has served for 28 years. He's president of Shae Wildlife and Environmental Services, which provides deer management services to ranches and farms across the Southeast and Midwest. He's an avid deer hunter and has taken numerous Pope and Young whitetails. And he's also considered to be, by many, one of the nation's foremost experts on chronic waste and disease. Please welcome to Ralph and Vicki's Off-Grid podcast, Mr. Steve Shae.
Hey, Steve, how are you, bud?
Hey, Steve, how's it going?
Hey, Ralph, Vicki, glad to be here. Glad you invited me.
Well, first off, we can't thank you enough, just to give a little bit of history to everybody. Heck, we've known each other for nearly 20 years, you know what I mean? And I remember a conversation, but it had to be 15 years ago, that we'd start talking down, sitting at Hoppy's, talking about CWD. Remember that?
I sure do. That was a long time ago, wasn't it?
Oh, buddy, and I'll never forget what you told me, because I've actually repeated that numerous times. And that is the biggest fear. And this was back then. You made that statement. The biggest challenge we will have in the future it's called CWD, and I'm like, huh? You know what I mean? And I guess that leads into,
what is it?
Yeah, what is CWD?
All right, what happens is in the world of the deer, there's these prions. It doesn't really matter what those are, but these prions, once they are taken in by a deer, and we'll talk a little bit about how that happens. In the brain, in everyone's brain, there's certain proteins. There's proteins throughout your whole body. Well, this prion causes those proteins basically to malform, or it basically malforms them. And these malformed proteins in the brain is what causes the paralysis and different neurological disorders, just like say Alzheimer's is in humans. Well, it causes a similar type of reaction, neurological disorder in the deer, which ends up leading to their death.
Now, okay. Now here's a question, because now we are, and Steve, we're playing a little dumber than we are. You know that. You know what I mean? Because we want people to understand this from A to Z. And knowing that hopefully right now our first whole conversation on this is more of the basic, and we'll go in more depth later. But a lot of people right now are seeing on social media, people are sending these little videos of a deer just standing there, and it's like on the side of a road, and it's not been hit. They're calling them zombie deer. You know what I mean? Is this what we're talking about, CWD?
Well, that definitely is a common symptom of CWD. Is the fear of people and that normal behavior where they just kind of stand there, kind of dumbfounded. But there's other diseases that can have similar symptoms. But the thing with CWD is it takes 18 to 24 months for a deer that's infected to actually start showing symptoms. So, for a 2-year period, a deer can look fine, act fine, but is actually a carrier of the disease. But once the symptoms start, it's rapidly progressive. And so it's just a matter of a few months, that deer will show all those symptoms and die. And so what you're reporting is when some people may see the deer in its final stages when it becomes symptomatic before it passes. And those behaviors you just described are a common one.
So what is, you had said earlier, Steve, that there can be a long incubation period for this disease to be in a deer. Did I just hear you say that can be 18 to 24 months, or can it be longer than that?
Well, in in known cases where they know when actually transmission or infection occurred, they know that from 18 to 24 months. It may be longer, it may be shorter. I'm sure that the range of time is different depending on the individual. But that's the average amount of time through research that found is 18 to 24 months.
Now, Steve, like when this occurs, when CWD, occurs, or let's say incubated, when it's in there, is there a possibility that deer can survive, or is it destined to die?
No, there's no cure. Once it's infected, it's going to die. There has been no research or studies that show that deer can survive this at this time. Now, there have been some genetic studies that show that certain genotypes of deer, it may take a little longer to kill them, but they all die. So, that's one thing that we know for sure is that it's a terminal disease that the deer are going to die from it.
Well, let me ask you this, Steve, because I think one of the big questions a lot of us have is, where did this come from? Yeah. When did it start? When was it first diagnosed? I mean, what is the origin of the CWD?
Yeah, well, in leading into that question, it's an important thing to know there are a few other TSE-type diseases that are prions, formed from prions. One is in cattle, and it's they call it BSE, and another one is in sheep, and it's called scrapie. Now, there is a rare form in humans. They call it Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, but that occurs in only like 350 people per year across all North America. But the big thing, what people believe is that it's possible that CWD came from scrapie. Back in the 1940s, scrapie was a known TSE that occurred in sheep out west. And at that time, some speculate that mule deer, that their range overlapped with scrapie-infected sheep on the front range of the Rocky Mountains, that's where the disease may have jumped from scrapie in sheep to mule deer in its form with mule deer with CWD. But that was where people think that it came from. Now, the first known CWD in deer was identified in the late 1960s in a Colorado research facility. So it was actually a captive population. And then in 1981, it was found in the wild in Colorado. And by the 1990s, it had been reported in the surrounding areas in northern Colorado and southern Wyoming. So out those western states there is where it was first identified and it was first known to occur in wild deer populations.
And you had sent us a map to kind of look at with the occurrence of where the CWD is, and that's a really heavy area out there in the west where we're on that map you were showing us.
Yeah, if you look,
most of Wyoming is totally covered by it.
Yeah, all of Wyoming, just about all of northern Colorado, western Kansas and Nebraska. So you can see that during that time how much the occurrence has grown and spread across those western states.
Hey, Steve, here's a question. Back in the late 80s, I had my elk camp, you know what I mean, where we were hunting out in central Colorado. And we came across, we had seen a couple bull elk that were in almost like a blood-soaked velvet. Their antlers the growth wasn't there. They were real gaunt. And they were telling us that it was because the elk got on wacky weed. It was I forgot. Oh man, I can't remember. But it was a plant that had no nutritional value, and this was at the time period that you're talking about. Could that have possibly been like CWD?
It's possible. Without having more information, it's difficult to tell. It could have been that the disorientation of the elk from the disease caused it, to damage or cause the velvet antlers to bleed because they weren't real careful about navigating through the brush and whatnot. So that it is possible, but too little information to tell.
Okay, Eleofer, right? Eleofer plant or whatever. That was, I think, the name of it. They said that these elk were getting on it, they were eating it, and it had no nutritional value. So it was literally, they were addicted to it, and they were eating it and literally dying But that's why I was just asking. That was, I remember years ago, when I first heard about it, and that was in the late 80s.
Yeah. But one of the things that's really interesting is if you look at that map and you see all the different spots of CWD that are now occurring, east of the Mississippi River, a lot of scientists speculate, and there's evidence to support it, that translocation of deer among captive herds behind high fences was one of the ways that it accelerated the spread of the disease and started it in other states that were far from its known occurrence area. So that's why a lot of states are prohibiting the translocation of deer cervids, to the different states, so they minimize transmission of the disease that way. So that's a really important point to note. We think that's how the disease spread so rapidly over such great distances, because we were helping it inadvertently, not knowing.
Right, not knowing, and people transporting those deer back and forth. And, just like a lot of states right now, for example, if we're hunting out of state and that state has CWD, you cannot bring the animal back. You have the skull plate completely cleaned out, and everything else.
You can't bring the brain or any kind of spinal anything with you.
Yeah, it's really good to check your regulations to know that, because some states, they don't care, and others, like my home state, if you're hunting in a state that has CWD, you have to follow certain protocols in order to bring that animal back into the state.
Well, you know what, too, Pete? I mean, even if they don't, why can't we be stewards? And even if it's not required, right, Steve? Would that not be a better thing for all of us to practice?
Well, let's educate the listener as to how to do that then.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and definitely. Later in the discussion, I'm going to talk a lot about what hunters can do to help minimize the spread and risk of spreading CWD in their state and other areas that they hunt.
You had mentioned that it's thought that the spread east is done by high fence operations. So my question is, would that be deer farms where they're breeding deer to capture urine and estrus glands and all those kind of things, or is it locations where people pay to go hunt, or both?
It could be both. I mean, a lot of people that have captive herds have varying reasons why they do it, but just movement of deer. Now there's pretty strict testing requirements, but, I think so now there's so limited options for people to be able to translocate. I don't know if you can in any states now, but whatever damage is done, it's already done. And so you just don't know what animals have been moved that could have been carriers of the disease. But one thing we do know is that right now on that map, there's 2 Canadian provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan, and 24 states, those in the Midwest, Southwest, and some limited areas on the East Coast that have confirmed cases in wild populations now. And if we think about that, we say, oh my gosh, but we're catching it relatively early. If you think about, how many counties across the United States have native deer populations, I think there's over 3,100 of them. And there's less than 300, or around 9%, that have known cases of CWD. So it's relatively small. We're catching it early. The challenge is how we can slow it down. And granted, there may be a lot of other areas in the country that have CWD. They just don't know it yet. Different states have different monitoring programs and testing programs, and some don't have any at all. And so there are probably other CWD areas in some states that aren't even known yet. So, that's disturbing too.
And the only way you can actually check for it is actually by having a carcass, correct? You can't actually go ahead and capture wild deer and do a test on them, correct, without actually killing them?
Yeah, you really need a sample of the brain, the spinal cord, or tonsils. That's where those prions aggregate in a deer that's infected, and so those can only be done after the deer is dead. Now there are some research that has been done where there's some limited success testing tonsil tissue from live deer. It's been relatively accurate in whitetails, but not elk. But that's very impractical, from a wild standpoint. So you basically just have to, use a deer. So
Gotcha.
Well, let me ask you this: if someone was to take a deer or some kind of servant animal in a state that has CWD, can it be transmitted to humans? Is there a certain way that we need to handle that meat or that animal to protect ourselves from that being transmitted to us?
Yeah, well, the biggest thing is most states that have known occurrence of CWD, they will test that animal if you want. So what I would recommend to all hunters that if you're hunting, especially in the CWD zone of another state, is to bring the head or some materials that they can test to have that animal tested. That's one. Now it's going to take some time, before you get those results back. So when you have that animal processed, and a lot of people, they're taking that animal from a different state back to their state, you need to let the processor know, hey, would you please process my deer separately? Don't mix it with, how some places they mix it all and
Right.
they give you whatever weight you want. Have them do it independently, and then you just freeze that deer and wait, and don't eat it until you get the test back. It's a lot of work to be able to do that, but that's probably the safest way to ensure that you're protecting yourself. The other thing too is when you're cleaning a deer from a CWD state or known zone, try to protect yourself. Wear rubber gloves. Try to not handle the organs and brain matter. As little as possible. So just take extra precautions that you normally wouldn't do, say in the past. Like I said, there's no evidence that those prions can infect humans at this time. But it's better to be safe than sorry,
So if the test result comes back positive, should you throw all that meat out, or do you handle it differently, or do you cook it to a certain temperature? Or
no, it's what the CDC recommends is do not eat that deer. What I would do is contact your state wildlife agency and ask them what the proper or recommended method of disposing of that meat is, and do that. So that's really important,
Okay, so if you don't know, like, and correct me because you're the biologist, because I do a lot of wild hog hunting and with the pseudorabies and brucellosis and all those kind of things, I've been trained that if you freeze it for a certain amount of time and then you cook it to a certain temperature, then you've killed everything in it and you're safe to eat. But you're saying with CWD that may not be the case.
Right. And that's one of the problems with a CWD. And we really didn't talk about transmission, but those prions they're very tolerable of temperature and an environment. And they've found that when they're deposited in the wild through feces or urine, that they can persist for years in the environment. So, you could have CWD positive animals and take every one off the landscape. I know you could never do that. Well, the area still can affect other deer once they become established because they stay persistent in the soil and water. So that's what makes this disease even more challenging, and the reason why some of those traditional methods we could do to, say, sterilize the meat won't work for this prion disease.
We'll be right back with more Ralph and Vicki's Off-Grid podcast with your host, Pete Rogers.
Ralph and Vicki's Off-Grid podcast is proudly brought to you by Alps, Easton Archery, Browning Firearms, Bass Pro Shops, Cabela's, Delta McKenzie Targets, New Archery Products, Muddy Outdoors, Cyclops Lights, Boss Buck Feeders, Hoyt Bows, Hunter's Blend Coffee, Hunter's Specialties, Spy Point, and True Glow.
Welcome back to Ralph and Vicki's Off-Grid podcast with your host, Pete Rogers. We're coming to you from the Hunter's Blend Coffee Studio. Now, let's get back into this week's show.
So, Steve, this goes back to one of the first introductions I had said earlier. 15, 18 years ago, you had made the statement that the most detrimental threat to deer hunting is CWD, and just listening to you and knowing what we know about it, I mean, this is not. People need to take this seriously. I mean, they need to understand it and grasp what what yours and the other biologists, the knowledge of having this and what it could mean to the future.
Yeah, and Ralph, a lot of it too is just the unknown. To date, there's no strong evidence to suggest that CWD can be transmitted to humans. However, it's not known if people can get infected with the CWD prion. And, CWD prion has been shown experimentally to infect squirrel monkeys and also some laboratory mice that carry some human genes. And then there's an additional study that began in 2009 by Canadian and German scientists. And they haven't published it yet, but they're showing that macaques, which is a monkey that's genetically closer to humans than any other animal, can be infected with the CWD prion. And so all these studies, even though there's no conclusive evidence, it kind of says, well, we just don't know. And some of this suggests that we need to be really careful on how we deal with CWD, treat the meat, and what risks we're willing to take in regards to taking deer and processing deer from CWD known zones.
So if a person processes their own meat like I do, I don't take mine to a processor. And I live in South Carolina, which, thank goodness, so far there's been no reported cases there. But if I'm coming here from Illinois to South Carolina, where would I take that to be tested?
Well, I wouldn't worry about it so much in a state that there's no known occurrences that are currently testing for the disease. Like, the extreme southeast seems to be pretty clear right now. You don't know for sure. But states that have known cases of CWD, they'll have testing locations where you can drop off heads. So they have actually certain places on their websites and in their brochures that actually direct hunters where they can take their samples to get tested.
Yeah, actually, here in Illinois, just so you know, we live in Carroll County. But Ogle County is a CWD county, which is just down the road from here. And they have a place where you go ahead and you drop the head off and whatever else they want, and they would go ahead and do the testing for you.
And if you're having the deer mounted, you would just cape it off the skull and leave them with the head.
Right. You can skull cap it so you could go ahead and do it and drop the rest of the head off for them.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. And I was saying that because so that the listeners would know what to do.
And actually, because as we're talking about this, so like I just said, we're in Carroll County, Illinois, okay, northwest corner. And Ogle County seriously isn't a mile down the road from us, but Ogle County is a mandatory check CWD. You shoot a deer, you have to go and get it checked.
Okay.
Okay, but we don't here in Carroll County. But again, it's only a mile away, which kind of makes you wonder, like maybe we need to go. Our game warden, Steve Beltran, always telling us, we need more samples.
Yeah, but those deer won't cross that county line.
No, they don't cross. They don't cross the county line. Yeah,
no,
it's the other side of the tracks. They're not going to do that.
They won't cross that creek. No way.
No, they know where the line is.
Steve, you touched on it, but what can we, all of us hunters, do? What could we do better?
Well, there's a lot. There's so many different things that we can do. One of the things is, and Ralph, Vicki, you guys have helped promoting this, is learn everything you can about CWD. The more you know, and the base of your foundation is stronger on CWD, you'll have the common sense of things to do and things not to do to help minimize the spread. One of the big things, there's a lot of information out there. Contact your state fish and wildlife agency. QDMA has a lot of information on CWD, the Deer Alliance. There's actually a CWD Alliance that also has a bunch of online information available. So that's really important. The other thing is CWD, and Ralph, based on our conversation 15 years ago, a lot of this stuff is coming true. And it's like you can have a doom and gloom outlook. It's important to keep a positive outlook. Wildlife conservation has faced many difficult challenges before, and we've always found a way, to work our way out of it. And I think eventually we will for CWD too. But I think CWD, just because of the nature of the disease, it's going to be a long, drawn-out battle to be able to get it to turn. But there's several other things that hunters can do. is one is if you're in a state that is CWD positive, or in a state like South Carolina that doesn't. If you see a deer that's behaving strangely or sick, or you find a fresh carcass of a deer that appeared to die because it was sick, report it to your Fish and Wildlife Agency right away. What most states will do is they'll specifically target sampling of reported sick deer. And so then they can help try to see if that deer actually had CWD. So that's one thing that you can really do that's very important. And also, if you're traveling to a portion of your state that you're not familiar, or another state, make sure to check to see what the CWD status is for that area. So you can make sure that you're following the prescribed rules and restrictions and guidance that the state agency may have for hunters that hunt there. The other big thing is like we already talked about, don't eat your venison until you have it tested if you're hunting in a CWD zone. If you travel out of state, with other hunters, make sure you know how it is, Ralph, is you're with a group of guys, and usually there's one guy that knows more about the others in the group because he's done his homework. Well, don't keep that to yourself. Share that information and educate your buddies and those around you, because that's really important from keeping them from making a mistake, which is really important. And the other thing too is I do this. I hunt in northern Missouri, which is CWD positive. Is keep the name of and phone number of the biologist, state biologist, and local game warden in your phone, so you can contact them depending if you have questions or if you see things. It's really important. And another thing too is how hunters live and discuss in certain circles. And unfortunately, and I know it still happens because there's been cases that have come up, there are still some that are illegally transporting live deer across state lines, which basically puts those herds at risk. There may be some hunters that are not skull capping and deboning their meat and bringing it in and then disposing of that, in the woods. So if you know anything like that's going on, you need to report that, because, unless someone steps up and stops it, it's going to continue. And it could continue to the point where it actually, causes prevalence to occur in your state, which of course nobody wants that.
No. Well, here's something, just thinking out loud. All right. And that is you shoot a deer, and think about this, Pete and Vicki. I mean, you shoot a deer, you're deboning it yourself, right? You've got the rest of the carcass. You live next to a farm, or you live on a farm, and you have an area that you throw all your,
it's a boneyard.
It's a boneyard. Next thing you know, you didn't have CWD, but you took that deer from a different state. You didn't realize it. You throw that carcass over in your boneyard, and boom. We as hunters who are trying to protect all this, literally just contaminated our area. You don't think of that.
Yeah, and there's no way that you would have known that you were doing that intentionally.
No.
Right, no, it's not intentional.
But one thing comes to my mind, too, is the taxidermists in other states. They're just taking our word for it where we got it. If we brought it from a CWD area, but we know we weren't supposed to bring it in illegal, I may say I killed this in Oklahoma instead of in Colorado, which is a really red state here. And so then the taxidermist has to dispose of all that stuff. And they're disposing it wherever, even if they're taking it to a landfill or wherever that, I'm not really sure what taxidermists do with all those carcasses, but there's so many ways that we could accidentally be spreading it without knowing it. So I think the key word there is to be intentional, to make sure, to double check, triple check, to be intentional that we are doing whatever we can as an individual.
Well, it's like Steve said, we have to police our own.
Right.
Literally, because I know a hot subject here in the state of Illinois, okay? And that is, how do you I'm going to just bring it up, Steve. And that is certain areas if they found a positive, the state comes in, and even though it's illegal to bait, they'll put bait out. They'll put corn or a pile of corn on a neighbor that gives them access. And then the game warden or someone, that is qualified through the state, they do some sharpshooting. Now we, for a fact, and you right, Vicki. I mean, we've heard the rumors. People say, "Man, I just saw the DNR. You know, their truck, and they had a trailer with 47 deer on it. You know what I mean? And,
it doesn't happen that way.
We know we were with Steve, one of our good game wardens, had 41 hours sitting over a bait pile in northwestern Illinois here, and shot one doe.
Right.
One doe. And so, but the surrounding landowners hear that and panic, right, Steve? I mean, they panic, and they don't want the Division of Wildlife to come in and shoot any of their deer.
Yeah, so they don't want to report a sick deer because they're afraid that something's going to happen, and all of a sudden DNR is going to come in there and tell them they got to wipe all the deer herd out.
Right? Yeah. I mean, I can tell you for a fact we know that's going on.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah. Well. And I was going to get that a little later, but to me, that's the elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about. What it basically comes. I'll give you kind of a scenario. In my opinion, the elephant in the room is basically the great opportunity cost that will be required that landowners, hunters, and those that lease and outfitters, that they're going to have to endure by making the decision to reduce the deer population now, so it doesn't spread. And if you think about it, and this will happen like the scenario you just explained, this is a huge. You think about the decision that you have to make. Is say, well, if we do nothing, we can just basically hold our ground. Don't let the state come in here. Don't adhere to enhanced antlerless harvest recommendations, and not shoot all these yearling bucks and all the things that the state may want you to do to help minimize the spread. But here you have an outfitter that is leasing property, and that's his biggest revenue producer. You have a landowner that bought that 2,000 acres just to deer hunt, and you have the leasee that's been leasing that property for 15 years and finally got it to where you want it. And now everything's going to change, and within 2 years, you've lost everything. And then you say, well, if I just don't participate, I still may get 5 or 10 years of good hunting out of it before CWD runs its course, and then you don't have the age structure anymore anyway. And so these are some of the things. This is a fictitious scenario that I just described, but it's a real life situation that a lot of people are having to deal with right now. And so what do? Do you buckle down? And it's almost like I talk about it as like you got the devil on one shoulder and you got the angel on the other shoulder. And the devil's telling you to be selfish, and the angel saying, no, you need to do your part for wildlife conservation. But if you listen to the angel, you're the way you like to hunt, or like the way you and I like to hunt, Ralph, and those older age structure bucks and whatnot, that'll go away immediately.
It's gone. Yeah.
It'll be gone forever, because this disease and how long it takes in our lifetime, you'll never, once that happens, in our lifetime, it'll never change. And it may be several lifetimes. That's the consequences of this disease. But then if you think about it from being selfish, it says, how do I know that the great deer hunting I've had for the last 5 years isn't because someone 30 miles away from me took one for the team for me?
So here's my question, because you had said that it takes like 18 to 24 months for it to incubate. So then automatically you're looking at a 1.5 to 2-year-old deer if it actually got it while it was a fawn. So what you're saying, basically, that's why it's looking like it's the more mature animals that are actually getting the CWD?
Well, yes. What the thing is it's interesting, is how CWD affects population. And that's a really loaded question. Is because we know that it's an 18 to 24 month
incubation,
right?
Incubation period. If you think about a lot of highly productive lands, east of the Mississippi, say the Midwest, we know that those herds are really highly productive. Twinning is very common in does from 1.5 years old and older. 75% of the fawns will reproduce. So on those type of habitats and populations, if you had 75% prevalence of CWD in the population, and every deer died when they were 3.5 years old, there's so much recruitment coming from the fawns, 1.5 and 2.5. You could still have a really high population of deer because they're not showing symptoms until they've had the disease for up to 2 years. And so, unfortunately, so you could have really still high, robust populations with just a very low age structure when you have really good habitat. But if you have real poor habitat, like a lot of the lower coastal plain habitats of the southeast and mountainous areas, they have real low recruitment. And usually just about 0%, especially those areas that have really late breeding seasons, you have no fawns breeding, and 1.5 will maybe have singletons, and 2.5 will be the first year that you may have 20. So you have such low recruitment. In those areas, if all deer died when they were 3.5 years old, there's not enough recruitment effort from the individuals left in the population to sustain that population, and you're going to have a population crash. So depending on what part of the country you live in is what will end up happening with CWD once the prevalence rate gets really high.
Okay. All right. Now you got me really going. All right. Now, Steve, here's a question. The largest, most populated state, not only for hunters, but deer, is it not Texas? I think it's number one,
yeah.
Right? Okay.
Yep.
Texas, the majority of that whole state, I mean, does protein, does corn, does all types of feeding 365 days a year. Yet, they're not seeing this issue, are they?
There is some spots in the wild, and there are some spots in captivity in Texas. But, based on the things you just described, it doesn't nearly have the reported prevalence that you may expect. So Texas is looking pretty good right now in regards to what we know the prevalence is,
We'll be right back with more Ralph and Vicki's Off-Grid podcast with your host, Pete Rogers.
After 40 years on the water, Tracker Off-Road brings quality and value to the land. This is the Tracker 800SX. It's not afraid of hard work. It's not afraid of the roughest ground. It's not afraid of a heavy load. And it's not afraid of being very, very quiet. A breakthrough American value starting at $10,999 plus free. The Tracker 800SX does it all.
Want every advantage you can get. That's why you choose SpyPoint, the unquestioned leader in trail camera technology. Features like the exclusive buck tracker technology save you time and make you a better hunter by letting you focus on images of bucks with a touch of a button. Class-leading technology, industry-leading data plans, and the easiest activation on the market. That's the Link series of cellular trail cameras from SpyPoint.
Welcome back to Ralph and Vicki's Off-Grid podcast with your host, Pete Rogers. We're coming to you from the Hunter's Blend Coffee Studio. Now, let's get back into this week's show.
And I guess this is just me being me, and that could screw up everything. But
amen.
I'll second that.
Yeah, go on, everybody. Steve, you didn't even back that one up. But I
do better.
Yeah, thanks, buddy. But I guess where I'm having a little glitch mentally is so here's Texas who feeds on a regular basis, who puts out tons of protein. And I mean, I love Texas. There's nothing I hope this isn't taken on a negative connotation at all, but how come they're not having the issue yet where we are and others that maybe don't feed. The state of Illinois, you can't feed at all, but the states that are baiting, they're seeing it, but Texas isn't. Is it? Why is that?
Well, remember, baiting doesn't cause the disease to occur. I mean, if you have the disease, baiting could enhance the risk of greater transmission rates and spread of the disease. So, Texas could bait all they want, but if there's no disease present, the baiting doesn't, make things worse. It's only if you have the disease. And a lot of people have to understand too is they don't understand, like in the scenario you described, Ralph, where DNR came in and had bait stations and then to shoot the deer, but they wouldn't let the hunters bait. Well, it's basically the risk assessment there. What those states are doing is, for a very short amount of time, they're putting bait on the ground because it's more important to remove deer than it is for the risk of maybe increasing some transmission at those sites. And then they'll come in after and they'll actually remove the residual bait in the soil. So if there was any infected deer at that site, that they're removing those prions. So, they're doing things in as a responsible manner as possible. And they're just measuring the risks. We're better off baiting temporarily because we can remove more deer, reduce the population. We feel that's going to reduce the risk of spreading the disease more than by doing the baiting. So that's kind of.
I think the key word that I'm hearing there is the word spreading of the disease. Whereas if it's not there, then the baiting's not going to spread it because it's not there. Right. Exactly. So, because that's the big thing in South Carolina, we can bait across our entire state on private land. But again, we don't have CWD, but it's like, well, do we need to stop baiting to keep it out? But if it's not present, then you're not spreading it.
You're not spreading.
Right. So baiting in and of itself, or the
is not the cause,
or the close proximity of saliva and eating is not the cause.
Right.
It's going to be the. Go ahead, Vicki.
And no, I was going to say, and Pete, we were talking before we got on the phone with Steve. You were talking how they were changing your laws about lures.
Yes.
About scents.
Yes. Which is just to get the listener up to date. In July or August of this year, they passed a law that said that we could not use any natural urine as a lure or a scent. Deer
synthetic
urine.
Now?
We can only use either what you harvest yourself from an animal.
From a local deer.
Yeah, so if I kill a doe and I want to harvest the urine out of the doe, then I can use that. Or I can use a synthetic urine, but I can't go purchase urine off the shelf because we don't know where that's coming from. Okay.
Yep.
We don't know if the farm that it came from has CWD or not.
Gotcha.
So that's how they're stopping it from coming in, or at least one of the efforts that they're making. And it was done, this past summer, and it was effective immediately.
And so here's my question for you, because when they passed it, I think when we were talking about it, you were kind of like, why would they do that? But now just talking to Steve for a little bit, it's actually making sense.
Well, it made sense that they passed it. What didn't make sense, and I think what upset most of the hunters locally was the timing, was they did it right before the opening of the season. Whereas people had already purchased all that stuff ahead of time, whereas it would just seem like if they were to go in this direction, they would have passed the law in January or March or something, as opposed to, basically the 1st of August, and our season opens August 15th. And that's what made hunters so upset. It wasn't the passing of the law. It was the timing. And also, we've already bought all this stuff, and, it's expensive.
Right.
It's about like $9 an ounce or more, depending on the brand. But yeah, I think to what Ralph said is it makes sense now is that if we don't bring it in, then we can't spread it.
Right. Yeah, they've done some research to show that, natural urine, they have found some prions in the natural urine, even though it's very low. And we don't know what load of prions are required to actually infect the deer. That's some of the research that still needs to be done. But they know that there is some present. So, let's minimize all risks that we have control over, and so that's why those laws are being passed in many states.
All right. So here's a good question. Here's the state of Illinois. You can't put mineral out. You can't put feed. I mean,
nothing, huh?
No, you can't put anything.
Salt blocks.
No.
No year
wow.
at any time of the season. But for the states or the provinces that have it that it is legal, Steve, would it be a better procedure for those hunters or those outfitters to keep that food source, that food source in a trough instead of on the ground? Is there any study or any research that would that help a little bit? Instead of
the thing is, Ralph, as I really don't think it's the food is not the issue. Just say that you had it in a trough. Well, so you have a point source where all those deer are coming to one trough. Well, all those deer are urinating, defecating, all right in that proximal area. That's where the prions are being shed. So, it doesn't really matter. It's just anything that concentrates deer into a point source. So it is a concentrated level of prions on the ground or in the water at that location. And then there's something attractant there that's bringing a bunch of deer to that one place where they could get infected. So that's what all these laws are trying to stop. And that's why, the not allowing baiting or salt blocks. And, and really, if I think about it, is, you asked the question before that deer do a lot of things naturally that put themselves at risk.
Licking branch. Yeah.
Licking branches and scrape sites. And, as well as I do, we have cameras on, scrape sites. And it amazes me how many deer of all sexes and ages frequent those traditional scrape sites. I mean, it's like every deer in this 200-acre woods coming to that one scrape.
Yes, sir.
So they're all putting themselves at risk just based on their natural behavior.
Well, they don't come by whenever I'm sitting over the scrape. Never, ever.
Well, here's what's funny. I've been an advocate forever. Water, food covering water.
Right.
You know what I mean? And we create water sources where we've never had any. Yet, if you think about it,
now that you're saying it, we're starting to question, should we do that?
I'm starting to question, is that a good thing too? You know what I mean? I'm putting a little water source up on top of a ridge that's never had water. I'm sort of helping the wildlife come out of a food source. They're feeding all night. They come into the timber instead of them going down to the creek line where my wind is at a disadvantage for me. I'm putting the water source up on top so I can control the wind better. And I have all these deer coming to this. I don't know. 10 by 20 foot water hole. Am I hurting something?
Yeah, Ralph, how I look at it, it's probably not, because if you look across the landscape, there's probably hundreds and thousands of those same scenarios that are natural, that are concentrating deer to water sources that are small places like that. So, and if you think about it too, is where I hunt in Missouri, it's cattle country. And so a lot of the needs that farmers do to meet the cattle's needs also are meeting whitetail's needs, water sources. They're putting out mineral licks, and so the deer are coming to those mineral licks. I mean, you look about pastures like on the farm that I hunt, they put out traditional mineral lick sites for the cattle. And then they rotate the cattle to a different pasture, and now there's no cattle in that pasture anymore. And the only thing that's coming to those mineral blocks are the deer.
Wildlife.
I mean, so even though the amount of that happening is reduced by hunters not being allowed to do it, it's still happening very much so because of normal cattle operations. And so I don't know how much those laws are really doing to slow the spread on areas like what I'm talking about, where it's happening so much already because of other animal husbandry. So it's going to be really site specific on how much that helps.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's going to be tough. I mean, yeah, we have been. Wow, this has gone. These 50 minutes have gone really, really fast. There's so much.
Is that 50 minutes already?
Yeah, it is.
And we could keep asking.
Well, here's the thing, Steve, before we even
have
think
a lot of questions.
Yes. This topic alone, I think, can consume many hours. And we can't thank you enough to finally speak to someone that is not only educated on a biological standpoint, but a hunter that you know what I mean, that sees it on an everyday basis in the timber. We definitely want to continue this, and also I'm going to bring up another subject, even though it wasn't even we were talking about it at all, and that is this EHD. So I'd love us to eventually bring that into another podcast.
Absolutely.
Because I know there's a lot of panic on that aspect as well as CWD.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up EHD. EHD probably has a much greater short-term immediate impact on deer hunting and deer populations than CWD. CWD has a much bigger, long-lasting impact, but from year to year, EHD is far greater of an impact on deer populations. I mean, we see it all the time in the areas where I hunt, the Midwest. So,
oh yeah, we've seen it too, buddy.
Yeah.
Now, so in other words, before we have Pete close all this, right now we have 2 strikes. CWD, EHD. Give us something positive, buddy.
Tell us some good news that's happening in the whitetail world.
Well, the good news is if you look at certain states that have had CWD for quite a while, I won't say they contained the spread of the disease, but the harvest management that they've implemented has really slowed it down. So that's very encouraging. There's a lot of research that's going on that can help us try to figure. The worst case scenario is do we have to wait for evolution to take its course in deer, basically through natural selection process to be able to overcome or survive the disease. I don't know. The problem with that is because this has such a long incubation period, deer populations continue to thrive. And so natural selection processes don't have to occur because there's still a lot of deer. If they were all dying and only the ones that could survive it survived, and then it started to change the genetic makeup, that's one thing. But with this disease, it doesn't do that. And so that makes the whole natural selection scenario seem kind of, you guys can scratch your head on that one,
Yeah, there's so many things running through my head right now.
I know my head is just like ready to explode. There's so much.
And to think how humbling this is, because I thought I was a little bit knowledgeable in CWD. I didn't know anything.
I
mean, you have just...
No, we're definitely going to have to call you back up.
You have really
Stevie.
enlightened me personally on so much about this, Steve, and I just want to thank you for taking the time to be with us. And listeners, we're going to get Steve back on here really soon, and we're going to dive into this even deeper. We have just pages of questions that we need to ask.
Well, I got to give a plug for my buddy too. You know what I mean? And that is, Steve, you've helped us tremendously through the years to be better land managers here at home, and even in Iowa. When we had the farm in Iowa, and I just want to put out there, folks. Listen, you can reach out and talk to Steve, and I mean, this guy is a wealth of knowledge and experience. And again, he is a true hunter. He knows, he's in it every day. And, to get him to come and look at your land and would be an investment that you will cherish for as long as you have that land. I just wanted to put that out.
And I tell you what we'll do is we'll
is.
put his contact information in our show notes, so that when people go to wherever they're listening, it'll be in the show notes, the contact information he gives us.
Right. Email, website, or something there.
Whatever he wants to give us, so that people can contact him directly.
Right. And we also need to say that because we do want to have you back here, Steve, that any of the listeners that are tuned in right now, if you have questions that you want to know about CWD or EHD or anything else that maybe Steve could help us out with, please send us the questions and we'll ask.
Absolutely.
Yep.
We'll build a bank of questions that our listeners want to know about, and we'll be able to ask those as well. Steve, do you have any closing comments that we forgot to mention before I kind of wrap this up?
Yeah, just one thing. I know when you introduced me, it sounded like you were insinuating I was a world authority on chronic wasting disease.
You're not?
I am not by far.
Oh, don't bust my bubble, man. Come on.
Oh, come on now. Now you're being modest.
No. I mean, I know a lot about CWD and have given several talks on it, but there's some, scientists out there that are world renowned in regards to chronic wasting disease. I know my share of it, but I'm by far a world authority on it. But the big thing, and Ralph, I'm a devout Christian person, and when it comes to us making the right decision on how we want to contribute to the management of this disease, you just have to ask yourself, what would God want me to do in regards to my responsibility? And how I look at it, you treat the wildlife resource and the other hunters that you respect just like you would anyone else in your family. And if you look at it that way, you make the right decision on what to do.
Wow.
Amen on that, buddy.
Absolutely.
Great way to wrap that up, Steve. I really appreciate that so much. Again, this is Steve Shae, who's joined us today, wildlife biologist, and we've been talking about chronic wasting disease. There's so much about this that we could get into. So if you've enjoyed the show, leave some comments, send us some questions. We're going to get Steve back on here again really soon, and we're going to dive into this a whole lot more. But for now, that's going to wrap up this episode of Ralph and Vicki's Off-Grid Podcast. I'm your host, Pete Rogers, and until next time, just make sure and subscribe, share it, tell everybody about it, and we'll be back with some more episodes real soon. Thanks for listening.
Ralph and Vicki's Off-Grid Podcast is brought to you by TruGlow. TruGlow is committed to providing their customers with innovative products containing quality and value-added features for archery, crossbow, and firearms. Now, anytime you shop at TruGlow.com, you can enter a promo code OFFGRID20 and receive 20% off of your purchase. This is a special offer for our Off-Grid Podcast listeners. How awesome is that? TruGlow, when brightness counts, count on TruGlow.
Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. We hope you come back again for more Ralph and Vicki's Off-Grid Podcast with your host, Pete Rogers.